We are here today with Professor Darryl Flaherty, University of Delaware, Crossroads class of 1985. Darryl is a professor of Japanese studies and other East Asian studies, University of Delaware, as we said, and wrote a book about legal practices, public arena, private arena, profit, lots of different things going on in the 19th century in Japan. Darryl, tell us a little bit about your book, please.
Sure. Um, the book started, I mean, this is sort of an extension or continuation of our earlier conversation, Arthur, but the book started in the early 20th century. I mean, in my mind, I went to Japan and my intention was to write a history of civic society, civil society in Japan, and look at groups of folks not at the sort of from the bottom up, like labor unions or peasant rebellions, which have been studied widely in Japanese history, and not from the top down. There's this image of the oppressive state, also in Japanese history for the late 19th and early 20th century, but rather to think how have people in the middle, and when I think about the middle, I mean people who have some resources, maybe they have some literacy, maybe they have some skills, how have they resolved conflict over time? And how have they shaped Japanese society and law and politics? And so um, the book, yeah, again, the sort of project began looking at the early 20th century and looking at a number of different kinds of groups. And then gradually I sort of pushed it back into the 19th century. So I started out looking at folks who were working at mid-level in the government, newspaper reporters, lawyers, all kinds of folks that we might think of as the middle class in the early 20th century Japan. And I began to look more and more at lawyers because one, they were interesting to me because they were really on the front lines of change. But also, as I began to study them more and more, I saw that there wasn't much of a history of what was happening in the going back into the Tokugawa period, which is the period from 1600 to 1868. And so if you think about that period, that's when there were shoguns. That's when samurai were walking around on the street with their hair shaved back to here and two swords. And so just about as different, if you're thinking about, similarity and difference across different cultures, that's about as different as you can get from a European idea of society. But at the same time, my book suggests that we can see similar practices in early modern Japan, which is what historians call the Tokugawa period, and early modern Europe. So it's not so different, is one of the things that I argue in the book.
So would I be correct in saying that the book somewhat parallels Westernization in Japan, or is that too gross a generalization?
So that's Westernization. That's an interesting idea. And I think what I would put myself more in the category of thinking about the emergence of a kind of global modernity. So if we think about like how has the world changed, and I think that there were processes across the planet. So oftentimes I'm trying to correct for a number of different things that I think are mistakes in how people think about the past. And one kind of mistake that I think people make is that they apply a contemporary idea of contemporary ideals that one can see or that used to be ideals. I'm not sure if they are anymore all across Europe and the United States, but there used to be ideals about expanding individual freedom, about rule of law. And so the book argues that we need to think about how in the 19th century it was and earlier in Europe and the United States, slavery was accepted. So there were certainly ideals that emerged out of the Enlightenment. Yes, so that's if we think about Westernization, then we're probably going to turn to think about the Enlightenment. And there was no Enlightenment moment in the way that we can think about in Europe and in Japan in the 18th and 19th century, but we can see other kinds of processes that I suggest get us to similar places. So that's what I'm arguing in the book.
And has the book been translated in Japanese?
It has been, yes, yeah, yeah.
And
Waseda University, which is one of the leading university presses in Japan, was kind enough to translate it and make it available. So,
so have any differences in the reception uh, in Japan and the United States?
um, yeah, so generally, in terms of historiography, in other words, how people think about the transition from the Tokugawa period to the Meiji period, the book is in the mainstream of the emerging historiography in the English language literature on Japan. And what I mean by that is, if we think about writing on the 19th century, the early 19th century, there's lots of writing that says, oh, we can see foreshadowings of modern Japan during the Tokugawa period. But it was only in sort of law and also politics. People said, no, 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 there's this big rupture in 1868. That's the Meiji Restoration. That's when you shift from shoguns to emperors, and then you're gradually moving toward the constitutional monarchy from 1890 going forward. So, so the book is in the mainstream of English language historiography, and your question was about Japanese language, and so it was received as such, and people were like, oh, this is a contribution to thinking about how that process, the sort of long transition, worked not just in industry or in other in theater or in other kinds of realms, but how did it work in law and legal practice? Within Japan, the response has been largely from legal historians, and they have their own very specific concerns and interests. And so, I mean, there was an enthusiastic response in the sense that the book was translated as a contribution to this sort of meta discussion or critique of the transition from Tokugawa to Meiji. But within Japan, the concerns have been more about did you get X or Y or Z correct? So there are a number of, and that's typical of sort of the different, being an insider versus being an outsider. And I think it would be the same if a Japanese scholar perhaps wrote a book about U.S. history, and you know, the U.S. historians might be more focused on what did you get correct or incorrect. So yeah.
Well, Darryl, I want to thank you very much. I wish we had more time.